Now, you mentioned communication, which I think is a really important one, sort of a nice little lead in, I suppose, into, I think the communication or the communicational strategies is so important because as soon as you start talking about these things, and I've been through a couple where companies that I led and then where I was coaching and they're asking for advice about how we actually communicate any sort of restructure to employees, because it's so important about how leaders would communicate that through. So, what sort of communication strategies would help employees understand the purpose behind a restructure?
Yeah. I think communication is the one thing that lets people down in these scenarios. If you're not proactive in your communication strategy, that's when it can turn into a mess and you have a lot of issues with people. So our recommendation is be upfront from the get-go. Where you might not have the perfect plan mapped out yet, but consult and engage with the business in totality and the individuals so there's no surprises when the final decision is made. Make sure that communication is clear both verbally and written, because we need to acknowledge that not everyone can take things in the same manner. So if
Yes.
you're sitting in, say, a town hall, a team meeting type of arrangement and sharing this information, and I could be sitting there going, oh my God, it sounds like I'm about to lose my job. How am I going to pay my mortgage? How am I going to feed my kids? I'm not actually processing what goes on. However, some people might take it on board, but I haven't. So then following up in a written form to make sure that there's no miscommunication and everyone has absorbed the information that's been shared. Always explain the why, because people need to understand the context to then create some form of acceptance. Because if these restructures do result in redundancies or even change in roles, people resist change.
Correct.
That's natural. It's just human nature. People resist it, whether that change is good or whether that change is bad. But making sure that you communicate it from the onset, be really open and frank, and show emotions.
Yeah.
Like the amount of times that I've made people redundant and you've used the words like, I'm really sorry, this is really difficult. Be a raw human and show that side of things, because as a business, we have had to have a lot of those difficult conversations, but the amount of times we've been thanked in the way in which we communicate and deal with the actual individual goes a long way. So
Yeah.
that's, yeah, I think no behind closed doors, no secrets, no 11th hour announcements. Get it out to the open as soon as possible in a human, ethical way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I suppose, like anything in life, we learn from mistakes. I know being through a couple myself of how to do it. To be fair, you stuff it up and you learn. And then you then learn to get good advice from companies like yourself, who then
Yes.
advise of how to do it better. Because what happens is you end up then in a situation where um, people just start talking, and it's the chatter behind that can then cause a little bit of toxicity, let's call it. Then
Correct.
the water cooler chats, and then suddenly there's a group of people heading out where there used to be maybe one or two going for a coffee, then there's 20 going for a coffee. What do you think they're talking about? The same thing,
Yeah. Correct.
you
It's
know?
Chinese whispers,
It's
and
Chinese whispers. Yeah,
that's where the message can go wrong from the get-go very quickly. So it's important that you're on top of these things. Like we've probably all seen and heard in the media about ANZ, how someone pressed go on an email and let a huge number of people know that their roles potentially could become redundant because of a restructure. They hadn't communicated that.
yeah,
So get on the front foot early.
yeah. That was only a couple of weeks ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is that the key message? So, um, sort of with restructures and how they can affect employee morale and culture, and it's even sometimes to the point of you sort of mentioned before, you can communicate it in different ways, obviously speaking, and then obviously in writing. And you're right, people often think, well, how is that going to affect my role? How am I going to pay my mortgage? I've got a baby on the way, or whatever it may be, and then bang, you go home and then you got to try and explain that to maybe mum and dad, or maybe your partner or your husband or your wife. It is difficult, isn't it? So what sort of advice can you provide to leaders how to manage that impact?
Show empathy, understand that people have a life outside once they leave the office or they leave the factory, that they have a lot of pressure. Their whole world is not just work. So think about ways that you can help make this process easier. Now, as I said, it might not result in a redundancy, but it could result in a job change that could be a loss in remuneration. So think about things to build the trust and offer support, EAP servicing, career counselling, introductions to recruitment agencies, resume writing workshops. There's so many different ways, financial advice, introduction to a financial planner. There's a lot of ways that you can lessen the burden in the way that you deliver it. And if you show empathy, and that will reduce the negative impact on your overall morale and culture within the workplace, because they can see that leaders genuinely care and they're sorry for the situation. But at the end of the day, it is business. So tough decisions are needed in business.